Today's presentation is all about teacher mental health, adults' mental health. We know that this situation is incredibly challenging, and educators are sort of at the front line. Tina's going to talk a little bit more about that later. And it's important for us to make sure that we're keeping in touch with our own responses and how do we help ourselves through those experiences. So a little bit about Momentous. A number of you are familiar with our work and our institute, and it's important to start with what it is we do and where we're coming from with these ideas. So the Momentous Institute is a nonprofit in the North Oak Cliff area. We've been around for 100 years, and our institute's really been at the forefront of mental health and education for the last 4 decades. And so our whole philosophy, our whole model is built around 3 avenues of service. So our first is our school, where I'm the principal. It's a lot of fun. We work with pre-K 3 to 5th graders, and it's a laboratory school model. We are constantly testing, evaluating, and researching how it is we can bring social emotional health and education together. The second aspect of our organization is our therapeutic services. We offer all kinds of different therapy services, play therapy, group therapy, marriage counseling, family counseling. We recognize that mental health is a huge factor in people's experiences through their day, and so we partner very closely with our therapeutic services. And the third aspect of our organization is our research and training. So we are constantly questioning, researching, evaluating, figuring out what's working, and training other folks about what it is we do. So many of you have perhaps toured the school or been to one of our trainings. Perhaps you've been to our conference, Changing the Odds. All of those are ways in which we are informing the broader community about the importance of this work. Tina, do you want to add anything about Momentous?
You're doing great so far, Daniel.
Awesome. This is great. And so we think it's important that when we use the word social emotional health, that we know what it is we're talking about. It's become a very popular topic these days, and people have different definitions of it. And so we like to start out with our own. And so social emotional health is the ability to understand and manage one's emotions, reactions, and relationships. It's a lot easier said than done. It is a process that is ongoing for adults and for children. We are constantly walking this talk as well. And we hope that today we're able to offer some ideas about how to manage and understand your own emotions, reactions, and relationships. So let's start with where we're at right now. I'm just gonna take a breath. We are living an entirely unknown reality right now. A month ago, this didn't seem possible, and here we are. And we are all stressed. Every one of us, kids, families, children, adults, we're all feeling it. And stress has a very interesting way of affecting all kinds of how we experience our day. It has such a profound effect on our body physiologically. It affects our brain. It affects the rest of how our organs respond. There's a chemical called cortisol that's released in moments of stress. And in some ways, stress is healthy. Stress is what gets us up, it gets us moving, and there's a fine balance. There's a moment where stress can become too much. And right now, many of us are tipping towards that too much moment. And it's important to recognize that that stress is affecting our mood, our reactions, our relationships, our work. And so today, we're going to talk about how that stress might show up and what you can do with it. And so Tina's going to go ahead and jump into the next part, which is about how this might affect you in your day-to-day.
Yeah, sure. So listen, we're hearing all this stuff about who's on the front lines. And I will tell you that we for sure know that you as teachers, administrators, school professionals, you guys are on the front lines all the time, even before COVID-19 hit. And I'm sure you've seen a lot more appreciation in this time frame as well, because people are becoming more aware of what it is that teachers actually not just do, but are facing every day. And so we want to just say how much we appreciate you. Our team in Innovation and Impact, Our training team, this is what we do. We spend our time with educators and school professionals throughout the year. So I'm a clinical social worker, I'm a therapist, but I spend my time with school professionals. So I feel like I'm honorary in a sense. So hopefully you guys will let me stay in that grouping, because I just feel so very proud of being able to work with people who are so committed to kids. And with that said, being on the front line, there's a lot that you have to face every day. And so there are some hidden factors that we believe impact our stress levels. And the other thing that I want to say before I get into this next piece is teacher mental health is very important to us. This is not something that just popped up as a result of COVID-19. We've been talking about this internally in our training. We cover it in different training offerings, but it's something that we are actually developing some specific content around to offer throughout the next year. We're super excited about it. We don't know what our training is going to look like, but we know it's going to include consistent support and consistent training around teacher mental health. We just can no longer deny the fact that that is an emerging and very important topic. And with that said, as we think about being stressed, yes, we're all stressed. And what does that stress look like? What is it made up of? So I wanted to talk about a couple of what I think are hidden factors. As we are working on the front lines every day, we may not know what it is that's really surfacing or bubbling up that's causing us stress. And the more that we are aware of, the better we can go toward it and can really work toward some important strategies that will support that. So the first thing is secondary trauma. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's a definition that's on your screen. I'll give you a second to read that. There's 2 words in there that I really want you to zero in on. And they are emotional distress. And the word stress is in distress. And so let's just think about trauma for a second. Trauma is the physiological and psychological, so it's a neurobiology, it's a brain impact as well as a body impact that happens when an event occurs and our response to it is a result of something that exceeds our ability to cope. Okay, so trauma is not the event itself, it's our response to what happened to the event. And different people experience events different ways. Daniel and I can both see the same event, but we can both experience that differently. And that happens with kids that you're serving, with families that you're serving, based upon what might be happening in their communities. But the issue is that when those experiences exceed the resources that we have to deal with it, trauma can develop. And trauma affects the brain, it affects learning, it affects our bodies, but it also affects you as teachers. It affects your capacity to teach and to show up in a way that's fully present, because you're dealing with some of those symptomology that happens when trauma shows up, and we'll talk about that in a second. So secondary trauma is actually possible when, in fact, we are hearing about, we're listening to, or we're observing experiences that are creating trauma for someone else. So let's stop and just absorb that, because we don't readily think about the fact that we can be impacted in the same way as somebody who's actually experiencing trauma firsthand. But we can. Research has shown us that. And so this is something that can be kind of subtle, and we want to be aware that that's the case. So let's think about a few things that could be causing secondary trauma. I know that many of you are working with kids who are in really difficult and dire circumstances. They were experiencing adverse childhood challenges before COVID-19, and they are experiencing them at the next level even now, because COVID-19 would simply just aggravate those experiences that are already happening. And you're able to see those kids when they come into your classroom. You're able to understand those stories, you know what's happening with them. So it's a little easier to maybe meet those needs. Now that we're doing distance learning, you can't have access to those kids directly. And so some of the understanding that those kids are in situations that are untenable, they may be in homes where there's domestic violence. We know that that's increased. There may be abuse and neglect. We know that those numbers are ticking up because of the sheltering at home. And so when you know about those food insecurities, many kids are not eating unless they're going to the schools. There's so many issues with kids that are on your mind. They're front and center and they're present for you. You're concerned about that because you're teachers. And that's what happens with teachers. We take on those kids as if they're part of our family. And so that can be causing stress, just knowing about, hearing about what's happening with those kids that you generally serve in your classrooms. Something else that could be pressing in as a secondary trauma source, get ready for this. Consistent media consumption. Yeah, so 24-hour news cycles on TV, on the phone. And then don't forget about the news cycle that comes on social media. You know your friends that post about what's happening in the news, but they don't get it completely right. So you got a little fake news in there too. But taking in all of that information, listening to how many infections every day, how many deaths are happening. And then as of late, a couple of the news stations have added in these stories about who is behind the death. So they're sharing special memories for families. And all of that can create trauma for us in absorbing all that. And then a third aspect that might impact us by way of secondary trauma is what's happening in our own space. Like we have friends and family members and colleagues that have lost people in their circles, friends that you know that may even be infected themselves with COVID-19. And so just hearing about all of that can create secondary trauma for us. So we want to be aware that this could be a factor that's causing us some emotional distress. And the more that we're aware, the more that we can go toward these. So let's talk about, how does secondary trauma show up? So let's look at some of the symptoms for it, and you'll see there on the slide. These are some indicators. You may see a few of these, a couple, and these are consistent with what symptoms are associated with trauma, firsthand trauma. I know that a big symptomology that we're hearing a lot from teachers right now is anxiety. It's that worry, it's the concern, it's that lack of focus and concentration, not being able to sleep because you're wired about, how am I going to manage all of these factors that I have to manage in managing my own kids in the home, being concerned about the kids that we serve, and trying to figure out how we're going to do this distance learning thing. There's a lot of anxiety already. And then when you add on this other consumption, then you've got a compounded issue there. So these are some of the symptoms that might be experienced by you or some of the people that you're working with and need to support. So here's the deal. And I know, Dan, you might want to talk a little bit about what some of the teachers at Momentous School have been experiencing as well.
Yep. When Tina showed me this list, I immediately thought of all the teachers that I work with, and I went down the list. And it's alarming how many teachers are experiencing each of these different symptoms. We talk a lot about how important it is to name something in order to understand it and then be able to do something with it. And so just looking at this list, seeing for yourself where you're popping up here can help. That's the first step to being able to do something with some of these feelings. So this is real. People are feeling this right now. You are not alone, not at all.
So here's the question. What do we do with these symptoms? How can we go toward trauma? And I think that's a great question. I am really super grateful for the work of one called Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. She's the founder of the Trauma Stewardship Institute. And she talks about this term trauma stewardship, and you may not have heard that term used. If it's your first time, just thinking about being a steward as a teacher, as an administrator, as a school professional, and if you're a mental health professional, my colleagues that are viewing as well, we steward care every day. And that is a challenge, it's a process. So the question then is, how are we going to steward care to others while stewarding our own care? And so what we talk about with trauma stewardship is we need to have a plan, just like we plan lessons, just like we plan how we're going to approach different challenges in our day. We need to have a plan for how we are going to care for ourselves. So there are questions on there thinking about, what is your plan to give care to others? We want you to be thinking about a trauma stewardship plan, because those symptoms are real and they won't go away unless we have a plan for how we might address those. So let me tell you a little bit about my trauma stewardship plan, and maybe that will give you an idea of what this plan could consist of. So one of the things that I'm doing more regularly, because I've been experiencing some of those symptoms myself, especially as a therapist and having to hold a lot of what we're hearing. And I think about Stephen Finn's work in this example. Stephen Finn talks about how we are the saucers for the cups that are our students, and their emotions are filling that cup, and so much of that emotion flows over on us and flows over into that saucer. And right now, saucers are having a hard time holding all of that. And so as we think about what's happening in our days, I know for me and for each of you, it's a lot. So one of the things that I'm doing on a daily basis is I'm giving myself, okay, I have to have coffee first. Okay, you got to do that because that helps me think, right? So after I have my coffee, there you go. Then I begin to think about, how am I feeling today? Where am I? Yesterday was a really challenging day for me yesterday. And Daniel knows I had a little bit of a meltdown. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But what I'm doing is I'm trying to identify if I have any of that symptomology, if there are any indicators for me. If I can't name what's happening, repeating Daniel, then I can't tame it. And that's a strategy from Drs. Dan Siegel and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. I have to be able to name it to tame it. So when I'm able to know what's happening with me for the day, then I can steward my day to adjust to that. So if I'm having a day where I'm feeling a little bit more anxious, I know I've got to take some more time out. I know I've got to be doing some additional breathing that's going to relax my nervous system, because that's what's elevated when we're stressed. And so I know I've got to do more breathing if I'm feeling really anxious. So I'm doing that at more intervals. If I'm feeling a little sad on some days, then I really want to reach out to my lifeline, and I want to have some time to talk and just say, hey, listen, I'm really dealing with this today. I just need somebody to connect with. And so as we understand what symptomology we're dealing with, then we can begin to put something in place for that. But we have to plan it, because if we don't plan it, we could easily go through our days and not be aware or be mindful of what's going on with us. So I want to just mention real quick about this plan before I back to Daniel, just to see if he has any other thoughts about this. I want to mention one thing about who can support your plan. So we all need community. And that's one of the things that we're learning how to do in a different way right now. We've been used to going out on Friday and maybe doing a happy hour, or maybe do something else on Friday. Maybe go home and just are zonked, because teachers are like totally worn out on Friday. We've been used to doing that and kind of talking through our day. So think about not just what you're going to put into your plan, how you're going to identify mindfully what's going on with you each day, and something you can do toward that particular symptomology. But then also, who can hold you accountable to make sure that you're taking care of you while you're stewarding care to others. So I will tell you real quickly, I've picked my sister, who is in Indianapolis. That's my hometown. And I called her the other day. We had a pretty stressful day that particular day. And I called her and I said, listen, I'm feeling a little heavy because we had a death in my friend's circle. And I said, I just need you to say a joke. Tell me a joke. I just need to laugh. And she told me this really corny joke. I'm going to share it with you because I think it's so funny. And you might want to use it at some point in your day or your week. But she said, okay, so tell me why eggs don't tell each other jokes. And I said, I give. And she said, because they would constantly be cracking up. Okay, so that just took a little bit of that pressure and that stress off. And then she told me a couple of others, and then I made up one that was really corny. But she's the person that supports my plan, but she's also what I call my lifeline. So you need lifeline, you need community, so that as you are stewarding your care and dealing with these symptoms, then you've got support. So Daniel, I don't know, is there something else that you're working with teachers that help with that?
I guess thinking about, and I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but thinking about myself, physical movement for me has been my saving grace in all of this. My dogs are exhausted because when I need a minute, we go for a walk. And we go for walks 4, 5, 6 times a day. I can't sit and stare at a computer all day. It doesn't work. And so for me, my plan is to get out as much as I can and move. And then the second thing is for me is keeping up with eating. My stress level raises when I'm hungry. It happens at school. It happens at home. My wife knows when I'm hungry. She's definitely somebody who supports that with me. But really, it's about setting that schedule, knowing what I'm going to be eating later, and having a little bit more control, right? I have a little bit more time when it comes to what I can prepare. And so I'm able to feel good about what it is I'm doing physically, which then clears up my mind to be ready to support teachers and students during the day. So that's a
Well,
little bit of my trauma stewardship plan. Yeah.
great. So as you're looking at that, just be thinking about when you can take some time to create a plan and who you will ask to be the person to hold you accountable. So that's one hidden factor that could be causing you some stress right now. We wanted to make sure we covered secondary trauma because it leads to compassion fatigue, and we want to make sure we can steward that. So here's the second hidden factor. It may be subtle, but for some it may even be stark. We don't always think about this when we're teaching, and that is grief. So what's interesting about what's happening right now with COVID-19 and this coronavirus era is that we are all globally grieving the same occurrence. That hasn't happened in my lifetime. I'm sure it hasn't happened in yours. Generally, before COVID-19, we would all grieve in some way because grief is a regular part of life, right? We might be grieving something in our colleague and faculty space, but it might be different. Somebody might be going through a divorce. Someone else might be getting chemo. Someone else might have experienced the death of a parent. So we could all support each other at different times in different ways. Right now, we are in a space of collective grieving because of this global occurrence. And so grief is real, and we may not understand that it's impacting our days. The one thing about grief is that when something happens that we valued and we lost it, and our bodies and our minds and our behaviors naturally respond to that loss. So we don't have to tell our bodies to grieve. It's a natural, involuntary response to something. So if you just think about it, when you've heard something during this process that's been very sad, sometimes tears will creep up on you and you didn't ask them to come. Or you may lay down at night and you didn't tell yourself, hey, stay awake all night. It just happens because we are wired to have a natural response to loss. So let's think for a moment about what are some losses that have occurred. When I listen to different teachers that I've talked to over the last few weeks, some of the losses that they've shared with me are related to the fact that, hey, I can't get to my classroom. I'm not going to the place that I did my student teaching and actually be able to go to a classroom and decorate my room and have that space as my context for which how I will serve and meet the needs of kids and where they can come and learn. So that community is no longer available. That's a loss. Or maybe it's the loss of being able to go and have some connection with other faculty members. That's been another loss that has been expressed. And then something else that's come up over and over again from elementary, middle school, high school teachers that I've talked to has been these rites of passages that won't happen this year. Signing days for kids, being able to be there to celebrate that. Kids that you've seen struggle and they've had successes that you won't get to celebrate that. Proms, graduations, those are losses that we have to acknowledge. This is having a huge impact on me, and I want to talk about these things. So what does grief look like? I'll talk about mourning in a moment because I want to talk a little bit about how does grief show up. So grief, much like trauma, is different for each person. There's really no right or wrong way to grieve. Some people use humor to get through grief because it just works for them, to have that little joking time or just to release some pressure. That may be a way that they've learned to cope with things that are hard. Some people have decidedly shown up in the fact that they just want to numb out. They become detached. Some people become workaholics. They want to go the opposite way, and they're just going to keep working all day so that they don't have to deal with or feel what's happening in their bodies and what they're thinking about. So grief can also look like poor concentration, so some similar symptoms to the secondary trauma. And incidentally, with secondary trauma, there are elements of grief, because with trauma, there has been loss that's occurred. So some of these symptoms can look the same. Maybe poor sleeping habits, not eating as you used to eat, not feeling like you want to do anything pleasurable. That is all symptomology that's associated with grief. And so, Daniel, I know some of the teachers at the Momentous School have talked a little bit about losses that they've been experiencing and also some symptoms that they're going through as well. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, the rites of passage stick out to me a lot. I was a 5th grade teacher at Momentous. There are so many moments that are saved for our graduating 5th graders. There's an overnight trip to camp, there's graduation, there's experiences with the Byron Nelson golf tournament. And the immediate reaction is none of those things are going to happen. And that is a serious sense of loss. One of our kindergarten teachers shared a really powerful moment with me. The end of kindergarten is when students make that transition to truly reading, right? They go from figuring it out to actually reading. And that's one of the most powerful moments in a kid's entire educational journey. And that's one of the reasons they are there and they are not getting that same experience. And it's a kind of a once in a lifetime chance, right? And so it's recognizing that that is out of our control. And we can try and be there for students in different ways. Our teachers are phenomenal at finding opportunities and challenges, but it's also important to stop and say, this is a real loss, and it's not coming back. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I like what you said, Daniel, about this, acknowledging that this is a loss. That's a big part of the first part of dealing with grief, because we want to talk about now, what do we do with the grief once we've identified that it's actually there? So the first thing is just acknowledging that loss and feeling it. But the overarching theme when it comes to grief is to make sure that we are mourning that. And the difference with grief and mourning is that grief is our natural response to something we've lost, but mourning is the intentional, regular task of processing through that grief. And so mourning is a task. That means it's work, and it's going to feel tough sometimes to do it. I'm sure many of you have heard the term, hey, you know what, just get over it. And people have told folks, you got to feel it, push past it, get over it. Well, it's not that easy. A task sometimes takes time. The important thing is not necessarily to think about getting over it, and we certainly can't get around it. It's going to be here, and it's a part of life. So our goal is to process through it, and that's what mourning is. And so I love the work of Dr. William J. Wharton. He is the professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. And he talks about, he has an evidence-based model that's called the 4 tasks of mourning. And so he gives us really some strategies for us to move through the grief by processing with mourning. And so you've got the slide up there. Here are 4 basic strategies, and these don't have to happen in any specific order, much like the stages of grief where we talk about anger and sadness and denial, shock, all of those stages. Those are emotional stages. These are stages for processing all of those emotions that we feel. But the first thing here is to accept the reality of the loss. So we have to acknowledge the loss occurred. And if we don't acknowledge it, we can't accept it. And at some point, this has got to happen. So we don't want to necessarily rush the grief process, but we do want to be moving through it. The second part of that is we've got to process the grief and pain. So let me just say right here, this is the really tough part. This may take some time, but we've got to be moving through it. So what does that mean? That means I have to express. I've got to emote. I've got to say what I'm feeling. I have to be able to name that. I also may have to cry about it. I need to journal about it. I may even need to see a therapist. I may need to talk to a colleague. We have to process that grief and pain. Then we need to adjust to life after the loss. So when does that happen? It happens as we're processing that grief and pain. So some of you have been able to make some adjustments, be flexible. When you think about loss, think about what is it that I miss? That helps us kind of identify what losses might be in place. And then how do I make a shift? What is a new perspective, a new way that I can begin to think about life apart from going to the classroom? How can I create community with my students in a different way than being in front of them every day? So thinking about what those adjustments look like. And one thing I know about working with teachers, you guys are full of strategies and full of ideas. I love that. So celebrate that. Be thinking about those new ways to adjust to life. And then the fourth thing is maintain a connection to those losses that you choose to while embracing the new. So just because you've shifted doesn't mean that you can't celebrate and honor what's been lost. One of the things a teacher told me that they had done was started to create a collage of all of their students' pictures, and that was a way for them to keep that in front of them. And they wanted to have that connection of what was happening in their classroom. They could see those faces as if they were right there in front of them, but it was keeping a connection while they were doing the distance learning and this new way of doing education. So there are different ways to do that, but we need to be processing through grief by mourning it. So here's the last thing that I'll share, and I know Daniel's gonna close out with just some final strategies. When you think about grief and mourning, I want you to think about a circle, okay? The circle represents healing, your process of healing. This is from a mentor of mine, Pastor Dr. Rodney Stodgel. He shared this with me some years ago and it stuck with me. If we think about grief, the process of grief is coming down one side of that circle, okay? That's where all of those emotions hang out, our intense feelings of what's happened to us by this loss. And that is necessary for us to get to healing. We have to feel, and feeling takes courage, y'all. Feeling takes courage because pain sometimes comes with feeling. So we've got to come down that part of the circle. But if we stop there, we can get stuck there. We can get stuck in all these heavy feelings and emotions, sorrow. We've got to come up through the mourning process to get to the full circle of healing. And that process is what we just went over. So yes, feel the emotions, and yes, mourn and process. And that's what helps our healing become complete. So Daniel, what would you add to that?
Another thought, and Tina, you shared this with me earlier before we were practicing with this, the importance of keeping moving because things are changing, right? And every day your teacher might be at a different place in that cycle. You know, one day they might be managing it. They might be coping with it. They might be maintaining that connection while embracing the new. And then something else happens and we're back. And that cycle has started again. And so it's important every time you have a chance to make a connection with somebody, check in and leave some space, listen, ask the second question, the third question, because people's space on that wheel is constantly changing. So how do we bring some of these ideas and help teachers manage them, manage the stress, manage the trauma, manage the mourning process, and know that it's very personal. It's something that everybody's doing on their own individual way. And these are some of the ways that we are working with our teachers to respond to some of these unique challenges. So what do we do? How do we handle it? Some days are better than others. Mondays are harder. Fridays are easier. It happens. So what do we do? A couple of things. First, Tina Payne Bryson, again, fantastic. Anything she puts out, read it, read it, read it. Her message that she is sharing with anybody that will listen right now is that what you're doing is enough. I'm going to say that again. Teachers, parents, mental health professionals, school administrators, what you are doing is enough. It might not feel like it. We always want to be doing something more because we so passionately care about the children that we work with, the families we work with. We can't do everything. And what we are doing is enough. By showing up every day and being there for children, you're doing enough. And teachers need to hear that all the time. Every morning, every day we have a staff time. That's the message. The second is around boundaries. The distance between work and home is not 6 feet apart. It is this close, right? It is together. There's very little boundary distance. There's no drive home to process how your day went. For a lot of us, it's like the hallway distance from our bedroom to our living room, right? That's the distance we have. We remind our teachers constantly that they have to set boundaries. You have to have a planning period. You have to have lunch. You have to go to the bathroom. All of those are things you still need to make sure you're doing. And when you're done for the day, you're done for the day. And it's important to tell your coworkers, your families that you're working with, that when you're done, you're done. You'll be there the next day, and that's okay. There's ways that these apps, you can hide them or make them go silent for certain periods of the day. You can set that boundary. The third is breathing, and Tina mentioned this earlier. It is something we're doing constantly, but also how much are we doing it mindfully? How much are we really pausing and noticing perhaps us holding our breath and what that feels like, paying attention to where we feel it in our body, how sore our low back is when we're breathing, and reminding us we need to stretch. So we're reminding teachers, and they're breathing with their students. They breathe in morning circles, they breathe in closing circles, they breathe at lunch with kids. They're doing it all the time. The last idea that I would offer is thinking about spheres of control. We did this with our teachers at our staff meeting on Wednesday. And if you have a piece of paper, draw 3 circles right now inside, small, middle, and then a larger one. The middle circle is what you can control. What is within your power to control? Maybe your bedtime, maybe what you eat, maybe what TV you watch, what's in your control. The middle circle, the second one, is what do you have influence over? What could you perhaps make an impact on? And then the third circle is what is outside of your control and your influence. And right now that list can feel extensive. That list might feel daunting. And think about that list and think about where you're spending your time. Where are you spending your mental energy? And is it in the outer circle? Is it in the inner circle? Is it somewhere in between? Knowing that, again, naming it to tame it is another step that you can take here. So with that, we're going to go ahead and stop screen sharing. That was a lot of information. A lot. And pacing was always something for me in the classroom that I had a challenge with. And so I know we said 20-25 minutes. We appreciate you sticking with us a tiny bit longer. Any middle school or high school teachers out there, the first lesson is never your, best lesson. You get better at it as you go. So what we're going to do now is Tina and I are going to open up the space for questions that you have, things that you're wondering about, things that you want to know more about. The Q&A spot at the bottom is the best place to submit your questions. What we'll do is we'll repeat the question so other people can hear it, and then we'll answer it. And we'll do that for as long as we have questions. And we'll go from there. So. So one question is around finding a balance of teaching from home and teaching your own children, working with your own children. If I had a hat, I would take it off to all of the parents out there who are trying to manage being a parent, being a teacher, being a spouse, being so many things all at once, and how challenging that can be to do each of those well, right? Any one of those is a full-time job. And now you're doing all of them at once. The boundaries piece, I think, is one of the biggest ones. Communicating to your work what your boundaries are is something that may be easier said than done. We know there are families who are still working, who are still out in the community, and so it's challenging to be at home with your children. When it comes to working, teaching your own children, the word I keep reminding families is independent. Your child is more independent than you think they are, and it's important to remind them of that too. Yes, in the classroom, teachers are answering questions all the time. We're repeating directions all the time, and that's a reality for families right now too. And it's important for you to set boundaries with your child, right? This activity, this experience, I'm going to set a timer, and for 15 minutes, that's what you're going to work on. If you've got questions, write them down. Otherwise, try and figure it out on your own. And that might give you some opportunity to work and perhaps take a breather yourself. Tina, do you want to add anything about the balance between trying to work and parent and teach all at once?
I think you covered that one pretty well. Yeah.
Thank you. So let me go ahead and move that to the answered question. In terms of easing anxiety for children, that is real. Children are so curious. It is so difficult to make a global pandemic make sense to children. It barely makes sense to us, and things keep changing. So the first thing that I would say is kids pick up on your emotional, just the aura, the energy you put out into the world. When you are stressed, kids pick up on that. When you're anxious, kids pick up on that. So the one of the best ways to help kids with anxiety is for you yourself to be centered. And again, much easier said than done. And maybe that means a lot of tears or processing behind closed doors so that your child maybe isn't seeing that as much. And really it's, how do you seem in control, even if you feel like you're not? A lot of it's faking it for children. And it's the idea of providing as much information as you feel confident in, right? It's educating yourself about how to keep ourselves safe, washing our hands, how germs are spread. All of those are lessons for children right now that will help ease their anxiety level. Tina, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just simply say that this is a time where you can talk about emotional literacy with your kids and just doing it and say, you know what, sometimes because of everything that's going on, mommy feels a little sad or mommy feels a little overwhelmed. And here's what I do to address that, or here's what I do to deal with that. And so maybe then that leads to an opportunity to say, how are you feeling? And do some breathing with together as a family or with your students. I think just being able to first, again, identify the emotion and then do a strategy where everybody together can come together in community and be able to relieve some of that stress that we're feeling on our nervous systems.
Yeah. Questions are coming through, so thank you all for sharing those. We're going to go ahead and answer. We're just going to kind of go down the list. Somebody talked about being a social emotional specialist at school and feeling like this message is what the administrators and teachers need to hear. And a lot of the focus is on academics. A lot of the focus is on how do we kind of keep school going. I think there's sort of two ways. One, you kind of get to be the like Trojan horse of social emotional health. You get to kind of sneak it into different ways. If it's not coming from the top down, your language, your questions, the way in which you talk to people will notice that. And they'll start to turn to you when they need help or support. I also think about like Maslow's hierarchy, and Momentous has its own staircase of social emotional development. And the first step is feeling safe and feeling seen, feeling heard. And when you feel those, it unlocks the academic potential for children. If they don't feel safe, if they don't feel seen, it's very, very difficult to learn. And so that's why with teachers, and right now more than ever, kids need to feel safe and heard. And so starting your lessons out with those experiences, building in checkpoints for students is another way to weave this into the academics. So perhaps they're working on a math problem, and at the end you ask them, what part did you struggle with and how did you overcome that struggle? And a kid responds to that, and then you can flip that. So how could you use that to handle how you're feeling right now with stress around the coronavirus? There are ways in which social emotional health complements and advances the learning. It doesn't take away from it. Tina, do you want to add anything there?
Now let's go to the next one. I think you get really well on that.
Yeah, you want to pick the next one?
Look, I need my readers on. I'm trying to see, see the question. Are there any other suggested activities that we can do during virtual staff meeting, similar to like the sphere of control to help teachers?
Yeah, a lot of, I would do, if we were in person, I would say raise your hand if you've been on a Zoom with 20 or 30 people at once. It is difficult. It's not the same. It's not the authentic conversation that we know generates so much of the beauty of a staff working together. So a couple of things that we're utilizing with our staff, the breakout rooms in Zoom are phenomenal. If you haven't figured out how to do those, I highly recommend it. You can email me afterwards. I can show you some of those tools. we are sending teachers off into small groups and posing questions for them. And that connection is so important. Seeing other colleagues, people that they love seeing every day, is so important in this. And frankly, that's where we're spending a lot of our time together, is building opportunities to connect and talk and process. We ask questions like, your highlight. What is something that made you smile? What is something you learned about a child that you think other people should know? Similar conversations we would be having at school. We're setting up opportunities for teachers to have those conversations. This afternoon, we have a check-in with our whole staff, and they're going to create a poster of what they know that somebody else should know about something that they've learned. And then they're going to kind of teach a small group something that they have figured out in all of this. So we're having some fun with it, right? It's not as serious. It's not a too long of a session. It's really bringing in opportunities to have fun and enjoy being around each other. That's helping keep motivation high. So, yeah.
This might be also a good opportunity to practice morning meeting for faculty, where you have a chance to do some greeting, a chance to have a reflective moment together, because that's a community opportunity to really think about what are we dealing with as a collective group. And then also, incorporate the breathing piece. That's part of morning meetings. So you'll hear me say that over and over again, because from the therapeutic side, we know that in order for us to pull out of the amygdala state, which is on alert when we're on high emotion, and also to calm our nervous system so we can do our best learning and best teaching, breathing is absolutely the way to do that, along with being able to emote. So if we can practice that during virtual staff meetings, then it's easier to turn it around when we're working with our children.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tina. Morning meetings are the best. Do them as much as possible. They're awesome. Somebody asked a question about sort of how do you process with teachers who jump right in? They go right into this thing with Google Classroom or grading students, or they start to talk about the student who's never showing up, and they don't spend the time at the beginning of the conversation checking in on themselves. That takes some skilled patience, questioning leadership skills from the people who are leading those conversations. It's tricky, right? Because you're asking people to be vulnerable. And some people really don't. They want to be doing the work because that's how they're processing it. So that might be one way that they're handling that secondary trauma and handling their mourning process. Like Tina said, some people get really busy, and that's how they handle some things. When it comes to the check-ins that I'm having with my staff, I ask, like, how's it going? And they say, good. And then I go, how are you actually doing? And then I wait. And there's a moment where they look at me and go, are we really going to go there? And I sit, and it's a powerful first question, but it's really the second question, the third question, because as soon as they share one thing, there's something for me to ask more about. Oh, I'm a little bit worried about my mom. Oh, can you tell me more about that? Like, what are you worried about with your mom? And I, again, fortunate enough that I know my staff. I know their kids. I know their interests. I know things that are on their minds. And so it's important for me to be asking about those things because I care about them. I really do. And it's important that they understand that they are people. I talk a lot about how when we are at our best, we can be our best for children. And so that's really sort of my lens of leadership, is if my staff feels supported, seen, heard, valued, then they're going to be there for kids. And so I don't ask, how's Google Classroom going? I ask, how are you doing? We'll get to the learning as we get there. So again, much easier said than done. All of this, much easier said than done.
One more thing, just something we hadn't brought up as much, but this is one of those times where we have to exercise extraordinary amounts of grace for one another. Nobody's been here before, and this is a difficult space to navigate. There's so many different factors, particularly that leaders are dealing with in trying to plan for this long term. It's difficult for teachers in their planning, so we've got to show each other some grace, and we've got to be very compassionate with ourselves and non-judgmental in this space. And, when we're able to do that, that might open up the opportunity to ask about, do you mind if we take a moment just to, talk about what's happening in our mornings or in our afternoons, whenever your meetings are. But just being able to have grace for those who are trying to figure it all out is important.
Yeah. They're doing enough. Yeah. Somebody mentioned programs like 10% Happier, Headspace. All of those are fantastic. I joke that there's kind of like blog fatigue right now. Everybody is sharing so many links all the time. And our marketing team is going to give me an earful if I don't post this next slide, which is that we also at Momentous have our own set of resources. So let me go ahead and share that with folks. If you check out momentusinstitute.org/blog, phenomenal amount of resources that are there, strategies, perspectives, ideas for you to consider for yourself or for your staff, or for families. There are videos. You'll see me and Tina in some of those videos. They're awesome. So check them out. That is another resource that I would send you to. Yeah, there's just so many out there right now. Find ones that mean something to you and stick with them. And honestly, I would say if 10% Happier and Headspace are where you find a lot of success, stick with those. This isn't necessarily a time to add more and more and more. In fact, quality over quantity. So. Tina, do you have a resource that you really like right now?
I love Momentous's blog, seriously.
Yeah.
I think it's great. We have really taken special care to think about some of the factors that are layered in with our mental health focus. So we're thinking about trauma with kids. We're thinking about inequities and disparities, and what does that mean for the families that we serve? And a lot of that is laced into our blogs because we realize that some of what's out there really has a lens for people who may have far more resources than a lot of the kids that we're working with. So we've had multiple conversations as we've been developing these blogs and a lot of the information we're putting out. What is it that might be getting missed in some of what you're seeing being put out by some of these other sources? Valuable information, but we want to drill down and think about the kids that you're working with generally on a consistent basis. I don't know how we are on time. I know there
got
were
a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Looking in the chat and seeing if we have anything.
So yeah, one raised a question about being unable to connect with a student. And some of the statistics are startling and shocking. My family all live in Maryland, and my mom was sharing a statistic that in, I believe, Baltimore County, 25% of students they haven't heard from. Teachers haven't been able to connect with them. And it's real. And it's oftentimes the students we already worry about the most. We know who they are. And this sense of not knowing it can be crushing. It's something that you'll find keeps you up at night. It sneaks into your thoughts maybe while you're having a meal. Keep acknowledging when those feelings happen. And also remind yourself that may be something that is out of your control. As tempting as it might be to drive to their house or try and find them, we can't, right? And it's this idea that we can continue reaching out in a respectful way. At some point, we don't want to go too far, right? There's an important boundary here. And when we do connect with those families, however that may be, celebrate and, reconnect on that relationship level. And it might be tempting, right? You might feel frustrated. You might want to voice that frustration. Where have you been? Why haven't you been responding? What people are doing the best they can. And it's important to let them just process that with you. And you aren't going to get a hold of all of your kids as much as that is a really, really difficult thing to accept.
That comes back to the sphere of control. So when you think about those circles, when you've done everything that you can do that's within your control, that you've reached out, you've made contact, what is outside of your control is the response that they would give. And so when we can identify that and recognize that, then we go to the place where we release the fact that we don't have control over that. And so we, as Daniel talked about, we can release that emotion and say, I've done everything I can do. And when we begin to say that, and our minds connect to that narrative that we've done the best that we can do, then we can emotionally be able to release some of that. It doesn't mean that the care goes away, but it gives us a chance to release some of the anxiety that we have, because we know that that's outside of our control, those families connecting back.
Tina, we've got one more question. How do we handle stress? There was an author that was mentioned. Did I mention Tina Payne Bryson? Was that, or did you have another author?
Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel's book, where they talk about the whole brain child. They've got some strategies in there with that. Again, we've got some great blog posts, not just from recent related to COVID-19. We have a host of resources that we've covered in the past about how to handle stress with kids, how to handle our own stress. So I want to invite you to go there first. And if you still want additional resources, reach out to us. We're happy to send those, but we definitely want to direct you to the resources that we have. There are plenty of them.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's not easy. And we signed up for jobs that were challenging, right? And now it's putting that to the test, and we are rising to that challenge. Good luck. Keep protecting your own mental well-being. And if we can help in any other way, please let us know. So.
Please reach out. Keep being great, you all.
Seriously. Have a wonderful Friday. Thank you all for joining us. Stay safe. Stay home.
Take care.
Yeah.